Καλώς ήρθατε στο Φιλανδικό Ινστιτούτο. Απόψε κυρίες και κύριοι, αξιότιμε κύριε πρέσβη, Your Excellency, όλοι οι συνεργάτες και αγαπητοί φίλοι. So, on the behalf of the Finnish Institute at Athens, I'm extremely happy to welcome you all here, our respected guest speakers, dear colleagues, co-workers, students, and our staff of the Finnish Institute. It's absolutely wonderful to see so many new faces here as well at the Institute. And of course, I have to say that always having amongst us the old faces gives us a big joy. So welcome you all. So we start, and I have a big pleasure and honor to ask Jari Gustafsson, Ambassador from Finland in Athens, here to greet us first, and then we go on with our program.
Ukrainian President Zelensky visited Helsinki yesterday. He met with our President Niinistö and all the leaders of the Nordic countries to discuss the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the need for a peaceful resolution based on the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Nordic countries repeated their support for Ukraine's peace formula, which includes several crucial objectives and that align with our own work. These include ensuring nuclear safety and addressing the environmental consequences of the conflict in Ukraine. As we all know, there is a growing recognition of the urgent need to establish the new international laws and regulations to prevent and mitigate the environmental damage during the times of war. The case of Ukraine highlights the importance of a combined approach that involves both a legal framework and diplomatic efforts. The work needed to address the environmental consequences of the conflict will likely take closer to decades than years, especially in areas such as Donbas region, which was already heavily polluted and industrialized prior to the conflict. However, we must remain committed to this work and ensure that justice is brought to the silent victim of war, nature. I'm confident that the work being done under the project Toxic Crimes will be an important step towards protecting the environment from wartime destruction. The Nordic countries stand ready to work with Ukraine to ensure the widest possible international involvement in implementing the peace formula and hopefully the upcoming peace summit. I wish you all an engaging and productive evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for my part, I'm the director of the Finnish Institute, Petra Pakkanen. As I said earlier, I once again welcome you very warmly this evening to the Institute. I'm just going to say just a couple of words about the Institute and why you are here, if you've been wondering of this. Now, the Finnish Institute is a scholarly institute. We are a research institute specialized in historical and archaeological study of Greece. But we do welcome also and support all research concerning Greek history, language, and society up to our own times. In fact, I am, at least personally, and I'm sure that everyone here at the Institute and amongst our staff as well, very happy to expand the horizons of our historical study of ancient Greece in particular to also encompass more modern contexts, since this may, as we hope, shed some light on the formation of ideas and practices of the world around us today. For instance, just these kind of a difficult and problematic issues that we are going to talk this evening. And let this evening be one experiment in this. First, of course, I want to express my warm thanks to Stavros Pantopoulos and the members of the Toxic Crimes project, which is funded by the Academy of Finland and the Kone Foundation. it has been really a pleasure to work with Stavros, but in particular, who has been here now for the recent time, to organize together. And we are very happy at the Institute that we have been able to contribute our share to the organization of this event. Not using more of our time from my part, because I'm going to return here after a while. Let's go forward, and we are going to have now our next person to greet us, Professor Maria Kuvuneli, University of Athens. Welcome here to say. Right.
With my thanks, Director, for your welcome here at the Finnish Institute, and with thanks to all of you who are actually here to talk about these issues tonight with us. Let me say first and foremost how pleased is Athens PIL to see all of you around here and actually see our idea of expanding and working in a network in practice. Some time ago, back in 2015, my colleague Fotini Pazadzis, who is now the Karamanlis Chair at Tufts University at Boston, decided that we need to build on the excellent reputation of the University of Athens, if I may say so myself, and our very long tradition of excellence in international law. And we came up with the idea to create an institute within the faculty, bringing together all our young researchers, and not those of us who have grown up a little bit. All our young researchers, most of them have actually graduated from the University of Athens, but we're also very, very happy to welcome people from around the world who would come actually and spend some time with us doing their own things, or even working in our own projects. One of the things that we have been doing is actually expanding in areas that fall within the traditional issues of international law, armed conflict, war, peace and war, but also all the new elements, if you like, of international law. Certainly environment, it is actually one of my specific interests, and I'm very happy to see more work done in that respect. Our younger colleagues have now flown the nest, and they are all over the place. Stavros Padazopoulos is currently at Helsinki, but at the same time, an invited researcher at the University of Athens, teaching some of you in the audience. And we're very, very pleased to see him taking the next steps onwards. As you've seen in the paperwork that is actually on your chairs, the impact of war on environment is nothing new. The discussion about the repercussions of war on the environment is brand new. And this is the type of thing that we need to expand more and more. That was a discussion that was pretty theoretical some time ago, or it was destined for the far-off places of Africa and Asia. To our horror, we came to realize that war is happening in Europe. And we do have a situation building up in Ukraine, which is not just armed conflict, which is not just a blatant breach of international law, but it is also a ticking bomb in terms of environmental impact. The project at Helsinki, I understand, worked already before Ukraine, doing all kinds of things, but I don't really think that you have suspected how topical you're going to be. So without further ado, I would like to thank you again for your hospitality and just welcome you to this evening's discussion. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for your very kind and very fine and just words. Then we have before we go to our main session, we have the representative of the Toxic Crimes Project, Freek van der Wet.
Yes, thank you very much, Petra. And thank you very much, Stavros, for organizing this event and for hosting us today. And thank you all for coming. Yes, my name is Freek van der Vette. I'm the principal investigator of the Toxic Crimes Project hosted at the University of Helsinki, at the law faculty, and specifically at the Anti-Instituutti for international law and human rights. So just very briefly, our project is interdisciplinary because we think that studying the protection of the environment during armed conflict requires an interdisciplinary approach. So in the project, we have Stavros as an environmental lawyer, international lawyer, and Mahakala as an environmental security expert and policy expert, and me as a social scientist with a background in qualitative research. And the project is indeed funded by the Academy of Finland and the Kone Foundation. So thank you once again for hosting us and for organizing, and I look forward to our discussion.
Honorable Ambassador, esteemed colleagues, dear students, it is with immense pleasure that we are welcoming you here. Thank you very much for your kind words, Petra. It was a pleasure and honor to work with you, and hopefully this was only the first step for a collaboration that's going to continue in the years to come. It is also a great honor to be representing here both the Toxic Crimes Project and, of course, Athens PIL. It is a joint endeavor, and I hope you will come to enjoy the benefits of the discussions that will follow. I will be moderating the main session here, 4 speeches. First, we will start, of course, with the director of the Finnish Institute, Dr. Petra Pakkanen. Her scholarly interests cover various fields of ancient Greek past, but she is also interested in the intersections where ancient and modern worlds and their ideologies meet, affect each other, and even clash with one another. In her research, she has specialized particularly in ancient Greek religion, its theoretical and practical aspects, and has worked with a so-called archaeology of cult, with reference to excavation projects in Greece. It is a joint paper, co-authored paper presentation together with Antti Lampinen, the assistant director of the Finnish Institute at Athens since 2018. Antti, between 2014 and 2018, has held postdoctoral fellowships at the universities of St. Andrews and Helsinki. His areas of particular interest include ancient historical, ethnographical, and geographical writing, portrayals of ethnic and religious outgroups, and the literary manifestations of stereotypes. He has also studied ancient oracular sanctuaries, late antique texts in Greek and Latin, and mobility and migration in the ancient world. In their presentation, Environment and Armed Conflict, a Historical Inquiry, Petra and Antti will offer some observations about the ancient context within the broader topic to be discussed in this workshop, with the hope to provide a window into the attitudes towards and modes of coping with the perennial problems of environment's relations to armed conflicts and war.
It is really wonderful to have some time to talk about more recent past this time. This is absolutely a joint paper with the Antti Lampinen and myself. He is sending you all lots of his very warm regards, and he tells that he is with us in spirit, but unfortunately he was not able to be here. So I'm trying to stand on 2 chairs in this case. As scholars of and historians of the more distant past, as I mentioned, he's fantastic actually, Antti Lampinen, and myself, we wish to offer you some observations about the ancient context within the broader topic to be discussed this evening. We hope that this may provide you with a window into the attitudes towards and modes of coping with the perennial problems of environment's relation to armed conflicts and war. We have compiled together some cases from the ancient sources which seem to have interesting implications or parallels to our conceptualizations of the problem today. they are there. So we decided to be ultra old-fashioned in this case. We are not having PowerPoint, but when was the last time that you've had a paper handout? Now you are going to have one. The reason is that you don't have to follow the presentation, but you get something in your hand to go back to when you leave the room, and then you're going to maybe read a little bit more about those texts that we're going to go through now. Our cases stem from both Greek and Roman contexts, though maybe a little bit more emphasis on the Greek side. When we consider the relationship between environment and war in ancient contexts, three factors seem to be particularly relevant to be briefly explored in this talk. Firstly, attitudes to the environment in terms of control. We may ask, does the nature control humans, or is it a man that conquers and takes control over nature and the environment? Second, war and armed conflicts were highly ritualized encounters in antiquity, which were not only conflicts between humans, but the gods played a significant role in how disputes started and how did they end. Lastly, thirdly, we are going to have a look at the effects of war on environment and the ways environmental destructions were perceived and encountered in antiquity. So there we go. War is the father of all and the king of all. This is quite famously stated by Heraclitus, one of the early Ionian philosophers, in one of the surviving fragments from his texts. It was indeed a recurring phenomenon which shaped Greek society and institutions. Military function and social and political status were closely related. Hence, the predominance in the classical period of the male citizen warrior, the exclusion of a woman from the political sphere, the literature's constant celebration of valor. Besides the celebration of valor, war was also, nevertheless, represented through the huge suffering it caused. Ancient Greek literature constantly emphasizes the destructive aspects of war, but its legitimacy was nevertheless ever. It was not challenged. If and indeed when an environment was destroyed in battles, it was therefore the making of humans, but in fact the gods were regarded to be behind it, either as punishers or earlier wrongdoings, or to show that the attention that they had received had not been or was not correct or sufficient. From the early Iron Age onwards, the ancient Greek societies took it for granted that intercommunal violence was, violence was part of the cycle of seasons. From small-scale expeditions of cattle rustling to systematic destructions of enemy communities' agricultural base, etc., influenced the way in which the Greeks moved and acted in their landscape. In this, which we could call landscape of war, the attitudes towards environment and the nature were shaped into a relationship where environment and nature were not only the theatres of warfare, but active participants in it. In the Roman era, nature itself could even appear as a target of conquest. The idea of a complete peace, as well as the complete dominion over the world, was in the Roman era, and to a certain degree during the Hellenistic period as well, often expressed through the formulation terra marique, on land and on the sea, that is. And thus the perfect ruler would similarly triumph over his foes, both on land and on the sea. The Roman ideology was thus prone to seeing the role of the empire as one of the perfecting the natural order, and for nature to be serving the humankind and not vice versa. With ancient ideas of warfare being so intimately wedded to the cycle of seasons of agricultural work and the months of idleness that could be devoted to the military expedition, it is easy to see how the notion would have arisen from the war itself as a nourishment of the conquered land. There are some references to this in your handout number 1. When Plutarch tells about the final defeat of the northern barbarian tribes called Gimbri and Teutones in the modern-day Provence area around 102 BC, he writes that, citation, "It is said that the people of Massalia, modern Marseille, built fences around their vineyards with the bones of the fallen Teutones, and that the soil, after the bodies had washed away in it and the rains had fallen all winter upon it, grew so rich that it produced an exceedingly great harvest in later years." Yet when nature presented hindrances and obstacles, it could itself be represented as a warlike opponent of enemy in the archaic and classical thought. This image can be found from the very beginning of the surviving Greek literature, from Homer in Iliad, your handout number 2, which describes Achilles' battle against the river Scamander below the walls of Troy. This river, or river card, this distinction was always a bit hazy in antiquity. So the river is angry at Achilles because he had polluted the Scamander's waters through the bodies of the dead Trojans. The river floods over and almost kills Achilles, and only with the help of the forest and a forest fire started by Hephaestus is the natural hazard constrained. This description actually includes an explicit mention of the damage to the river banks, trees, vegetation, fish around it, and it's in this sense also very interesting. But an even more concrete case of wanting to punish nature is found in Herodotus, and this is similarly a course of action from the character whose pride and hubris knows no bounds. As the great king of Achaemenid Empire, Xerxes, is in the text marching against the Greeks and orders the narrow strait of the Hellespont to be flogged, that is, beaten with 300 lashes. Xerxes now thereby also initiated the excavations of the canal in Chalkidiki. And the text describes this. Bitter water, our master that punishes you because you did him wrong, though he had done you none. Xerxes the king will pass over you, whether you want it or not. In accordance with justice, no one offers you sacrifice, for you are the turbid and briny river. While these actions are presented in the text from the point of view of slightly bemused Greeks, it has in fact been noted that the Xerxes behaves here entirely in keeping with the old Near Eastern traditions of the kingship, where the ruler of the earth is supposed to triumph both over high mountains and the wild sea. The conquest of nature was also part of the legitimation of the Roman Empire. Especially when the Romans sought to dominate the Central European expanse of impenetrable forests, the idea of local resistance concentrating on holy groves exercised a powerful hold over the Roman imagination. The ideal was a nature made to serve the human needs, and thus a nice hillside would be made even nicer by a well-fenced stone quarry, for instance, or a little river made to serve the imperial economy by placing a water mill there. For this type of case, the Gallic and Germanic forests were a cause for anxiety. No wonder, then, that the first century CE writer like Lucan and Tacitus constantly portray Roman commanders hacking down old sacred groves, and that the Emperor Trajan's monuments show his soldiers slashing their way through the forest of Dacia, for instance. In the end of your handout, you have a picture where you can check that out later on. But even so, Romans also acknowledged that this type of relentless pursuit to dominate and reorder the natural environment could constitute an act of hubris, indeed an act of warfare against the order of nature. Thus we see Pliny's morally inflected criticism of the Roman mining operations in Spain. You have passages on this on the handout number 3. Using the vocabulary of conquest, Pliny strongly suspects that the human greed was now directing the Romans to violate the natural order in a way that could easily lead them to lose their moral upper hand. We are dealing with an early instance of eco-criticism, we could say here, limited though it is, or different that it seems for us. However, war was also a risky business, and nature posed an unpredictable adversary. The Greek text regularly used forms of the verb kinduneuen, in the ancient Greek, the verb from kindinos, danger, as a direct synonym for fighting a battle. This sense of the verb is particularly common in the Greek historical writing. Greek authors thus cast their discussions about fighting in a battle in the vocabulary of risk and danger. In his histories, Herodotus describes how for instance, how the nomadic horsemen Cimmerians debated whether to resist the invading Scythians, and the common people there, he tells, argued that there was no sense of taking the risk, kinduneuen, their lives for land. The Scythians they would simply abandon it immediately, it is thought. This was because the Scythians were regarded as people who were perfectly tuned with nature and their environment. In the limitless plains of numerous large rivers of modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, where they inhabited, and therefore the Scythians were not dependent on owning a plot of earth in the same way as the Greeks did. The old idea, thus, of nomadism as the most perfect form of freedom is presented constantly in Herodotus' representations of the Scythians. They were people who could not be conquered, and a conquering empire could never get a grasp over the group of peoples like them who were as fluid as rivers and limitless as the steppe, he wrote. You have this in handout number 4. Herodotus' portrayal is surprisingly revealing for the attitudes towards people's relation to their environment if we put it in par with the words of Xenophon, who in his Memorabilia compares environmental destruction with enslavement of people. In this case, through the words put in the mouth of Socrates, of course, your handout number 5, where it's written, men cut the grain that the others have planted and chopped down their trees, and in all ways harass the weaker if they refuse to submit, until they are forced to choose slavery rather than war with the stronger. Now, this would not have been possible. There would have been any reason to try this approach with the Scythians, who could not be enslaved by invading their environment simply because they could easily find another place to live in harmony with their new environment. Then, when narrating warfare, Greek authors built meticulous causal framework to explain victory and defeat, and their accounts typically allowed for a range of human and environmental factors. Success in war was ascribed to divine favor, or the Greek authors assessed outcome of fighting in battle in hindsight as the work of fate. The role of religion in Greek worldwide is a complex issue, as we know, since we, in our modern mindset, are accustomed to separate religious aspects of life and thought from the secular spheres. But this does not work with ancient Greek worldview. Religion infiltrates the thought and practices rather holistically. It could be argued, in fact, that warfare provided, for example, one of the main, if not the principal occasion for the employment of animal sacrifice in a structured and consistent ritualized manner in Greek religion. The meaning of rituals was to get an assurance of approval, or at least withholding of hostility from the part of the superhuman, that is, the parts of the cosmos which were outside the human control. From our point of view here, this part also included the environment. The sense of limits of human influence on the course of events led Xenophon, for instance, to urge military leaders to consult the gods at every turn to attain as much knowledge and control over their situation as they could. He claims that the most important lesson of all that Cambyses imparted to his son Kyrus was to never risk either by yourself or with the army if the sacrifices and omens are against it. In archaic and classical Greece, battle and animal sacrifice were indeed intricately bound together. The corollary of this is that there was no violent conflict between cities without the violence of animal sacrifice. Each armed conflict involving the slaughter of hoplites and the shedding of human blood was preceded by a slaughter of animals and the spilling of their blood. So, through such rituals, like the pre-battle rituals, which were done in the face of all the army, very openly, at the battlefield where human life and the future were at risk, war became the paradigm of other human activities. Attention to the gods was constantly reinforced, and thereby human guilt and possible failures were sidelined. Sacrificing and obtaining the omens was a risk management practice that worked on multiple levels. But this also meant that the environmental damage caused by the armed conflicts didn't get therefore underlined, and the blame was then not taken by the humans who in practice carried them out, but it was sidelined to the sphere of the gods. As we have seen, nature and its elements were often made gods. It could be argued that the deification of nature in the ancient Greek religious thinking could have also substantially contributed to the respect and protection of the environment and to the human relations with the rest of the ecosystem. However, for instance, Donald Hughes concludes in his book on environmental problems in antiquity, he concludes the book by asserting that the man can be in balance with nature only during times of peace. The statement that echoes Tacitus's criticism of Roman imperialism to the speech of a barbarian leader, which you see on your handout number 6, when he states that the Romans make a dessert and call it peace. I'm getting closer to the end, so don't worry. There is clear evidence that the Greeks did perceive and mourn the destruction that warfare could wreak on the environment. Plato described the region around Athens in Critias and lamented that what now remains compared with what earlier existed is like a skeleton of a sick man, all the fat and soft earth having wasted away, and not only the bare framework of the land is left. In any case, the purposeful destruction of the ecological basis of an enemy society was a wholly conventional part of ancient warfare, and it and it concerned also their institutions connected with the nature and its resources. Similar destructions of, for instance, the Ovi Groves in Attica, in many ways the backbone of the state's finances, was recorded often and many times in antiquity. We have one mention there where it was recalled as the worst destruction ever since the Persian Wars. You have a reference that in your handout as well. In terms of our theme today, it has been claimed that the militarization of the Mediterranean ecosystem through examples of both unintentional and intentional environmental damage caused by war and other military activities damaged environment seriously in antiquity. Hence that Plato's lament referred to before. Warfare certainly was costly to the environment with shorter and longer term effects. Forests were largely overexploited. Great trees were often burned as part of the military operation for shipbuilding, which resulted in deforestation and therefore to degradation of soil nutrition, devastation of natural habitats, and so on and so forth. J. Donald Hughes listed several factors that he sees as reasons for classical antiquity's failure to maintain a sustainable balance with the Mediterranean ecosystem. Cultural attitudes, scientific knowledge, treatment of women, appropriate technology, governmental policies, the economy, slavery, and, most importantly, frequent wars. Yet, as the major factor, he put forward for what he sees as the collapse of classical antiquity was the environmental damage caused by ancient Greeks and Romans, who were principally at odds with each other. We do not necessarily have to be as pessimistic as Hughes is, and we can instead try to learn something from these notions above, to get some food for thought from the observed insights into the ancient views and attitudes towards war and its relation to the environment. So first, attitudes to dominion over the control of the nature. Is there a huge difference, after all, between antiquity and now, even though it might come across like that? Second, interconnectedness of attitudes towards the war in general and in religious ideologies toward the nature and environment. And lastly, the occasional acknowledgement that environmental losses not only made states less resilient, but also possibly caused the societies lose supernatural favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. Thank you, Petra, and everybody organizing this event. I was hoping to have, or I meant to have, some photographs to illustrate some of the points that I'm making, but they kind of sort of ran up against the immovable object of my own technological incompetence. As Stavros said, or as he alluded to at least, I'm trying to cover quite a lot of ground in a very brief period, and that does necessitate a degree of sort of hopping in a slightly unnuanced fashion from subject to subject. But I'm going to kind of, just for the intents and purposes of this talk, explain this sort of nexus through the prism of Iraq and, to a certain extent, Syria's experience. These are both places where I've been working a lot over the past sort of 8 or 9 years. And they're also countries that kind of, very unfortunately for their own inhabitants, are kind of horribly alarming illustrations of this particular phenomenon. So the sort of first part of this sort of brief discussion is the kind of ways in which climate change contributes to, or kind of wider environmental degradation contributes to sort of instability and conflict. As Stavros said, this is precisely what I'm writing a book about at the moment, so I could bore you till the end of time. But just to sort of very briefly touch on this, you've likely heard of the characterization of climate change as a threat multiplier, something that kind of hurls fuel on already smoldering fires. Now, this is a sort of characterization that's kind of deeply imperfect, but again, for the intents and purposes of a brief discussion, we're going to run with that. But I just want to give you 3 brief examples about how, in an Iraqi context, climate change and wider environmental degradation are contributing to the instability that those countries have experienced since 2014. So the first one of which is kind of in the area of Salahuddin, which is a sort of mostly rural governorate about halfway between Baghdad and Mosul. I did a lot of field work in which I found that villages that had no source of supplementary irrigation, so no irrigation canal with access to the Tigris River, no access to sort of deep borehole wells, and as a consequence that were reliant on rain and rain alone, yielded on average about 3 times the number of ISIS fighters as villages that had a very similar kind of ethno-religious makeup, but that had access to a form of irrigation canal or access to some kind of deep bore well. A second kind of brief example was that sort of communities that were kind of peri-urban, in that they were kind of close to a major urban center like Mosul, for example, were much more likely to yield large numbers of ISIS fighters than villages that were kind of significantly more distant than cities. And off the back of a lot of work in the Mosul area in particular, my conclusion was that at a time when these farmers were getting battered by climate change, at a time when they and their profession were suffering horribly, they had a kind of real illustration of the kind of the haves and the have-nots, because of course the urban dwellers on their doorstep were for the most part not suffering from climate-related issues. So when we talk about climate change and its relationship with instability, it's intensely complicated. It's seldom, if ever, enough to kind of prompt conflict on its own, but just as sort of brief illustrations of how it kind of fits into the wider dynamic, the kind of wider matrix. So this brings us then to the second part of the equation. So you're in a state of conflict for reasons either related to climate change, an environment, or in most instances, a whole bunch of different drivers of instability. Well, what's next for the environment? If you think about it, kind of environmental degradation or kind of is almost always bearing some kind of it's often sort of suffering as a consequence of a shortfall of governance or of kind of state failure at large. So kind of when you have excessive wastewater in a community or a country where kind of governance is not of the quality that it ought to be, generally it's the waterways that kind of bear the brunt of that collapse. When you have excess solid waste in kind of a similar situation, it gets sort of dumped into kind of otherwise pristine bits of natural landscape, or kind of pollutants get kind of burnt off with kind of no recourse to justice. Well, if you think about it, kind of conflict is in many ways the most extreme form of state failure. And again, in an Iraqi, Syrian context and kind of other instances, this is sort of played out in 2 particular ways. The first one of which is direct. Iraq has been in a state of near unbroken conflict since about 1980, and every single one of these conflicts has left an extremely bleak mark on the country's landscape. So the Iran-Iraq War, which was fought from 1980 to 1988, kind of saddled the countryside with between 20 to 25 million landmines. It cost Iraq about 3/4 of its date palms, some 20 million or so trees. The Gulf Wars, the kind of 1990, 1991, and the 2003 onwards conflicts also contributed to kind of everything from depleted uranium in the soil to kind of a general breakdown in law and order, which kind of left the environment in about as bleak a state as one could imagine. You had the domestic rebellions, those of the Kurds and Shiites in the far south, both of which Saddam crushed in an extremely ruthless fashion with very bleak consequences for kind of the landscape around. And then no less importantly, I will get in a minute to the kind of perhaps most recent of these conflicts, sort of ISIS, but no less importantly are the indirect environmental consequences of conflict. Here you have the lost climate action, for example, that comes with conflict, in which governments are utterly distracted, budgets are redirected. I mean, in the case of Iraq, in 2013, the year before ISIS came along, the Ministry of Water Resources had a $1.7 billion capital budget. So that's a budget for all things not related to pensions and salaries. The following year, 2014, that was down to $30 million. You have kind of an extreme disempowering of the already generally quite unempowered environment ministries in these countries. So in 2015, The Ministry of Environment in Iraq was kind of deprioritized and rolled into the Ministry of Health. You have just the ambassador mentioned that this talk is sort of playing out against the backdrop of the Ukraine conflict. I don't know if some of you might be aware that among the many things that Ukraine is understandably suing Russia for is the lost climate action that will result both from the last year of kind of society being kind of utterly oriented towards its own defense and the likely lost climate action over the years to come. So then this brings us to the third and final point of this sort of brief rundown of the ways in which this kind of bitter cycle plays out. And that's the point that, again, in an Iraqi context, the country sort of finds itself in now. The hot war is over. It's existing in a state of peace of sorts. But so much of the environmental degradation left behind by 3 to 4 years, depending on which way you categorize it, of the ISIS conflict has meant that much of the rural parts of the country are in an extremely bleak state. ISIS not only kind of contributed to huge amounts of collateral damage against the environment during its war, but it also perpetrated these kind of scorched earth tactics as it was beaten back. Its kind of maxim was seemingly, well, if we can't have the country, nor can you, kind of in inverted commas. And so to visit rural parts of sort of western or central or northern Iraq is to often find rural communities for whom the conflict ended 5, 6, 7 years ago, but in which it might as well have ended last week, given the state of their collapsed electricity and water infrastructure, given the fact that many of them were robbed of every bit of farm equipment and machinery that they need to kind of go about their daily lives. And as a consequence, many of these farmers that were already reeling rather badly from the direct consequences of climate change, the direct consequences of environmental degradation, and the direct consequences of a kind of agricultural system that in Iraq is not really fit for purpose, are struggling even more to kind of break any kind of profit because everything they need to sort of do their jobs is essentially in tatters. You have even fiercer degrees of anti-state resentment than you previously did. So in Iraq, as in so many countries, rural people often feel, often correctly, that they are receiving significantly worse services than that of their urban counterparts. And so when I would travel in Iraq kind of immediately prior to ISIS's surge in 2014, in a lot of these rural communities, you would feel this extreme sense of apprehension, suspicion, animosity. And to travel through many of these communities again now, you get a very similar sense. Now, that's not to say necessarily that you have the kind of makings of sort of ISIS 2.0. It's just that when you have that kind of state of raw resentment in which rural people feel, again, rightly or wrongly, that they are being deprioritized relative to everybody else in the country, when you have people who are suffering from collapsed livelihoods and little recourse to repair them, but equally even fewer kind of alternative ways of making a living, well, great things tend not to emerge in that sort of situation. While there's a whole bunch of kind of non-climate, non-environment related reasons as to why a kind of renewed jihadi offensive in rural Iraq is not particularly likely, rural Iraq and rural Syria will remain kind of nodes of instability and discontent of some sort for as long as their kind of economic bread and butter is just not viable. I'll quickly finish off with just a few sort of points on what it can take to break this sort of cycle of violence. Because, as several said, I come from an environmental journalist background, even though I've sort of slowly been segueing into sort of other directions. I've got much more used to sort of, looking at the nature of a problem than having to come up with solutions. And it's much easier talking about what's wrong than it is sort of proposing solutions or recommendations. And I'm kind of now almost clamoring to be back on the other side, but, well, that ship has sailed. The first one of which is of these sort of points is to sort of recognize which communities are most vulnerable to both economic deprivation and the violence that can feed off it. We know that the countries in the world, or the communities that are most vulnerable to climate-related instability, are those that have large cross shares of the population working in agriculture, working in pastoralism, working in fishing, the professions that are uniquely vulnerable to climate stresses.
So much for your very kind introduction. I also wish to thank the Finnish Institute at Athens, the Public International Law Center of the Athens University, and the Toxic Crimes Project of the Helsinki University for the kind invitation to be part of this interesting and timely discussion. It's really a great pleasure and honor to do so. The previous speakers have made abundantly clear why we cannot anymore regard environmental protection as a secondary or marginal concern in armed conflict. There are historical roots to this topic, but also new dimensions, in particular the fact that environmental damage in armed conflict, as we know today, may contribute to global environmental challenges such as the climate change and loss of biodiversity. We are also increasingly, much more than before, we are increasingly aware of the close interrelationship between protection of civilians on the one hand and protection of the environment on the other hand in armed conflict. The UN General Assembly recognized this last year in adopting two resolutions that are of direct relevance to the subject we are discussing tonight. At the end of July, the General Assembly recognized the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And in December, it took note of the International Law Commission's principles on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict, underlining the importance of the topic for international relations and calling for the widest possible dissemination of the principles and commentaries. This is what I wanted to say before beginning the speech I was asked to do. My task tonight is to give you an overview of the legal framework for the protection of the environment in armed conflict, how international law contributes to the protection of the environment in situations of conflict and in post-conflict situations. I will divide my presentation into three parts. I will first outline the hard core of the international law, relevant international law, namely the existing treaty provisions that directly address environmental damage caused in conflict. Second, I will speak of more recent developments, in particular the ILC principles as the latest addition to the legal framework, protecting the environment in and in relation to armed conflicts, but also referring to the International Committee of the Red Cross's updated guidelines on the protection of the natural environment in armed conflict. And third, I will touch on the question whether the international legal framework for the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts is sufficiently developed and effective. I should begin by saying that the history of efforts to regulate warfare throughout, the focus has been on the protection of civilians. The extensive body of international humanitarian law that has been codified since the late 19th century is not primarily concerned with the environment. Important steps to reduce wartime environmental harm
have been taken, but only after particularly shocking events, such as the mass spreading of herbicides during the Vietnam War, which immediately triggered developments in treaty law. Similarly, after the invasion and occupation of Kuwait by Iraq in 1990, the UN Security Council took unprecedented steps in implementing Iraq's international responsibility, including for damage that had been caused to the environment. For instance, by setting oil fields in fire. While protection of the environment from the dangers of war thus is not a new concern, it has been addressed sporadically. What is even more noteworthy is that the substantive provisions that are in place were adopted before the important body of international environmental law was developed in the past decades. And in general, international environmental law and the law of armed conflict have developed separately, which had made it challenging to identify the necessary mutual connections. We'll begin with the existing treaty law, which expressly addresses environmental damage caused in armed conflict. This acquis consists of the Convention on Environmental Modification, the so-called ENMOD Convention, and two environmental provisions in Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, all adopted in the aftermath of the Vietnam War in the 70s. The ENMOD Convention prohibits military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques as a means of destruction, damage, or injury to another state party, when such techniques have widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects. The first of the relevant Additional Protocol 1 provisions prohibits the use of any methods and means of warfare that are intended or may be expected to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the environment. The second provision requires states parties to take care to protect the environment against widespread, long-term, and severe damage. And the third prohibits reprisals against the natural environment. While the ENMOD Convention's formulation with the disjunctive or is more flexible than the Additional Protocol 1 formulation, requiring that the effects are widespread, long-term, and severe. All these provisions set a high threshold for action that is prohibited in armed conflict. This threshold has often been called as impractically high. At the time of the negotiations on Additional Protocol 1, it was widely accepted that environmental damage incidental to conventional warfare would normally not be covered by the prohibition. At the same time, these provisions have undisputed value as an absolute limit to the environmental harm that can be caused in conflict. The International Court of Justice called them as a powerful constraint to state parties. They may also have had some preventive effect. For instance, at the time when the ENMOD Convention was negotiated, there was great concern about the possibility of manipulation of the environment emerging as a new means of warfare. That this has not materialized, maybe partly due to the existence of a clear prohibition. both the ICRC guidelines and the ILC principles contain provisions modeled after the AP1 Additional Protocol 1 rules and the ENMOD Convention, and comment on their status and interpretation. One important point in this regard concerns the standard of widespread, long-term and severe, and the need, when assessing the practical implications of the prohibition and the obligation of due regard, to take into account current scientific knowledge and understanding of ecological processes. The commentary to the ILC principles points out that the interpretation of the standard cannot only rely on how the concept of environmental damage was understood in the 1970s, but must take into account current scientific knowledge of ecological processes. In this regard, it is important, for instance, that the risk of damage should not be conceptualized only in terms of harm to a specific object, but should also take into account any indirect or cumulative effects, and the possibility that the fragile interdependent system of both living and non-living components may be affected. The 2020 ICRC guidelines contain a similar comment about the need to consider current knowledge, including on the connectedness and interrelationships of different parts of the natural environment. As pointed out, the ENMOD Convention and the Additional Protocol 1 provisions are the only treaty provisions providing direct protection to the environment. The only other one I should mention is the environmental war crime in the statute of the International Criminal Court, but it's basically the same with some additional conditions than the prohibition in Additional Protocol 1. So this is what we have in terms of treaty law. The recent legal developments regarding the environment and armed conflict have taken another form and largely rely on the interpretation of existing rights and obligations. This is true to a certain extent for the ILC principles, which contribute to the clarification and codification of the existing international law, but also contain proposals for its further development. The ICRC guidelines on the protection of the natural environment in armed conflict, on their part, have been presented as a restatement of law. They contain rules and recommendations drawn on international humanitarian law and on certain disarmament treaties. And this is quite important. They reveal the potential of many rules that were originally designed to protect civilians to also protect the environment, to provide general or indirect protection to the environment. The fundamental basis for such indirect protection is the understanding of the environment, or the natural environment, to use the Additional Protocol 1's term, as a civilian object. The ICRC guidelines point out that it's generally recognized today by default that the natural environment is civilian in character. The ILC principles also underline the inherently civilian nature of the environment. In a provision reading, I quote, "No part of the environment may be attacked unless it has become a military objective," unquote. The phrases by default, unless it has, and inherently all have the same function. They indicate that the protection is conditional, and that the particular part of the environment loses its protection if it becomes a military objective. A part of the environment, such as a field, forest, or hill, becomes a military objective in accordance with the established IHL definition if it by its nature, location, use, or purpose makes an effective contribution to the military effort, so that its destruction would amount to a definite military advantage. A large part of the protection that IHL, International Humanitarian Law rules, provide to the environment depends on the understanding of the environment as inherently civilian. As a consequence of the civilian nature of the environment, for instance, the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions apply to the environment. This is also the case for many of the specific rules of IHL. The understanding of the environment as inherently civilian in nature gets support from current scientific knowledge, as well as from the legal and political recognition of the interrelationship between the health and survival of humans and the quality of the environment. Turning now to the ILC principles. I will first give a few comments on their general nature. The defining feature is the temporal scope. The principles on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict cover the entire life cycle of an armed conflict, the time before, during, and after armed conflict, including situations of occupation. This temporal scope derives from the recognition that to be effective, protection of the environment must be continuous from the time before the conflict, throughout the conflict, and in post-conflict situations. Preventive measures are likely to be the most effective if they are taken before the conflict breaks out. Environmental effects of armed conflict also continue to be felt in its aftermath, sometimes for decades and longer. And timely action to address them may prevent greater harm and facilitate the transition to a sustainable peace. The broad temporal scope of the ILC principles also means that the topic does not only focus on the obligations of the warring parties, but also seeks to clarify what obligations other non-belligerent states or international organizations may have, and what they could and should do to enhance environmental protection in relation to armed conflicts. The principles address questions concerning the conduct of hostilities, but they also deal with peace operations, humanitarian assistance, protection of the territories of indigenous peoples, and regulation of business entities. The broad focus of the ILC work has furthermore made it necessary to go beyond the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law. The principles draw on other areas of international law, particularly international human rights law and international environmental law. Both these areas of law are obviously relevant in pre- and post-conflict phases, but they also have a role to play during armed conflict, including and in particular in situations of occupation. A further feature worth mentioning is that the principles do not, in general, distinguish between international and non-international armed conflicts. Some of them only apply to international armed conflicts, but several principles use notions that include non-state armed groups and take into account, for instance, the fact that it has been a common phenomenon in recent conflicts that non-state armed groups exercise control over territories and people. In addition, some of the principles are of practical importance for non-international armed conflicts. And I should underline that this is not a question of applicability, that they would only apply in non-international armed conflicts. It's a question of relevance. I'll come back to this later. That there is no general distinction between international and non-international armed conflicts is an aspect that has generated quite a lot of debate in the General Assembly over the years. But I should add that it only has relevance with regard to the principles applicable during armed conflict. Most of the altogether 27 principles are thus unaffected by the classification of armed conflicts. In general, however, the issue is of great importance, as the treaty law on non-international conflicts is rather limited. It would be important to further harmonize the legal frameworks applicable in international and non-international armed conflicts. While the ILC principles only make a modest contribution to the harmonization, their reception in the General Assembly shows that states, unfortunately, are still quite divided in this regard. Finally, while the principles cover a broad array of measures across the conflict life cycle that seek to prevent, mitigate, and remediate environmental harm resulting from the conflict, they do not do so in a comprehensive manner. Rather, the Commission has identified certain issues that are particularly relevant for the protection of the environment in conflict-affected areas. And in this, I should underline, it has profited from consultations with relevant expert organizations, including the UN Environment Programme, the UNESCO, and the International Committee, the Red Cross, and from related research. Obviously, the Commission has also benefited from regular feedback from states through the General Assembly, as is always the case with its work. Thanks to these consultations, the work on the topic has been able to rely on the enhanced understanding of the direct and indirect effects of armed conflicts, whether resulting from the conduct of hostilities or from the particular circumstances created by and around armed conflicts. I would now like to take a few examples of the principles. I mentioned that the topic does not only focus on the obligations of the parties to a conflict. Some measures are, in fact, most effective if they are taken by other states than those that are involved in the conflict. Reference can, in this regard, be made to the two principles on due diligence by business enterprises and liability of business enterprises. These provisions ask states to take appropriate measures with a view to ensuring that business enterprises operating in conflict areas or conflict-affected areas exercise environmental due diligence and can be held liable when they or their subsidiaries cause environmental harm. These principles address both the home states and host states of business enterprises. But the home states may often be in a better position to provide adequate and effective procedures and remedies to the victims of environmental harm. The Commission recalls in this regard that collapse of state and local institutions is a common phenomenon in conflict-affected countries, and one that undermines law enforcement and protection of rights, as well as the integrity of justice. Also, in the aftermath of conflict. Similarly, the principles seeking to reduce the environmental footprint of peace operations and military presence, or to minimize the environmental impact of conflict-induced human displacement, are addressed primarily to states not involved in the conflict. They are also addressed to international organizations and other relevant actors, as the case may be. I also said that one of the objectives of the Commission's work on the topic has been to clarify how the existing international law protects the environment in relation to armed conflicts. It was obvious that there was a need for such clarification with regard to the law of occupation, given that the primary legal instruments, the 1907 Hague Regulations and the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, lack specific provisions on the protection of the environment. At the same time, most of the rules of the law of occupation are of a general nature and have proved flexible enough to be adapted to changing circumstances. The Commission has therefore been able to base the principles relative to situations of occupation on existing customary law obligations, which have been interpreted in light of subsequent developments in international law, in particular international environmental law and human rights law. These principles spell out the environmental obligations that an occupying power has towards the occupied population, the occupied state, and other states. I would also like to highlight the principle on state responsibility, which restates the fundamental rule that every internationally wrongful act of a state entails its international responsibility and gives rise to an obligation to make full reparation. It is specified that this rule applies to wrongful acts causing environmental damage in relation to armed conflict, whether in breach of the rules of jus ad bellum, the law on the use of force, jus in bello, international humanitarian law, or other applicable rules of international law. The principle and its commentary also draw on the recent jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice regarding the special responsibility of an aggressor state, the special responsibility of an occupying power, and the compensability of environmental damage in armed conflict. I'll come back to this as well. A number of other principles complement the one on state responsibility and address the issue of remediation from a pragmatic point of view. They deal with sharing of and granting access to environmental information, post-conflict environmental assessments and remedial measures, as well as relief and assistance. Most notably, these complementing principles are not only addressed to the parties or former parties to a conflict, but also to other states or international organizations that are in the position to provide information or remedy. I also mentioned that some principles are of practical importance for non-international armed conflicts. For example, it is well known that armed conflicts in resource-rich countries tend to accelerate illegal exploitation of natural resources. Altogether, 5 principles address the question of illegal and unsustainable exploitation of natural resources. One of the relevant principles restates the prohibition of pillage, an established customary rule which protects all natural resources that can be subject to ownership and constitute property. In situations of occupation, the prohibition of pillage forms an absolute limit to the exploitation of the natural resources of an occupied territory by the occupying power. At the same time, the principles relative to occupation take into account more long-term environmental degradation linked to harmful occupation practices. One of them seeks to protect the natural resources of the occupied territory from excessive and unsustainable use. The two principles on due diligence and liability of business enterprises I mentioned earlier are also relevant in the context of illegal exploitation of natural resources in conflict-affected areas. And the last principle in this cluster addresses inadvertent environmental effects of human displacement, which are often these inadvertent environmental effects. They are often related to the use of natural resources for food and shelter. Let me add that illegal and unsustainable use of natural resources, as well as the inadvertent environmental effects of human displacement, have been recognized as being among the main pathways for environmental harm in non-international armed conflict. I am now moving to the last question. How effective is this legal framework? Is it sufficient? How do the ILC principles and the ICRC guidelines contribute to it? Regarding the first 2 questions, I would venture to say that international law is rather well equipped to address, for instance, the kind of environmental damage that has been inflicted on Ukraine in the course of the ongoing war of aggression by the Russian Federation. There is no lack of applicable rules. First, this is an international armed conflict. Both Ukraine and Russia are parties to the first additional protocol and to a number of relevant disarmament treaties, and therefore bound by many provisions that provide protection to the environment. When such rules are violated, the international responsibility of the violator is engaged. Second, regarding the special responsibility for an act of aggression, an aggressor state is responsible for all damage that can be established to have a sufficiently direct and certain causal nexus to its violation of the prohibition of the use of force. That has a sufficiently direct and certain causal nexus to the fact of aggression. What is particularly noteworthy is that for this responsibility to be established, there's no need to prove that war crimes have been committed or that other international law obligations have been violated. Third, and this is relevant given the 9-year occupation of Crimea and the occupation of parts of eastern Ukraine by the Russian Federation. An occupying power has a duty of vigilance to prevent violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, not only by its own armed forces, but also by third parties. And fourth, damage that is compensable under international law includes damage to the environment, whether or not damage has also been caused to persons or property. And importantly, this principle also applies in armed conflict. The validity of all these points, which are reflected in the ILC principles and commentaries, has been confirmed in recent jurisprudence at the International Court of Justice. It's true that Russian Federation cannot be taken to the International Court of Justice for its aggression, as Russia has not consented to the general jurisdiction of the court. But the ICJ case law, just outlined, would be an important point of reference for other bodies applying international law. What the Russian war in Ukraine has highlighted is not the need to have additional rules, but the need to strengthen the mechanisms for sanctioning non-compliance and the implementation of responsibility for violations of the law, including accountability for environmental damage. This includes the ongoing efforts to hold Russia accountable for the damage it has caused in Ukraine and the damage it has caused to the environment of Ukraine. Inspiration can be drawn in this regard from the few successful cases in which the aggressor's responsibility, including for environmental damage, has been established and compensation paid. The most notable cases in this regard are the establishment of the UN Compensation Commission in relation to the invasion and occupation of Kuwait by Iraq, and the recent reparations judgment of the International Court of Justice in the armed activities case between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. Regarding substantive law, there would be a need to further develop regulation at the national, regional, or international level regarding activities in relation to armed conflicts, whether concerning the due diligence and liability of business enterprises, establishment of protected zones, reducing the environmental footprint of military activities, or other relevant measures, many of which have been identified in the ILC principles. Perhaps the most urgent question regarding substantive law relates to the need to harmonize the legal frameworks applicable in international and non-international armed conflicts. With this in mind, I would like to conclude by the words of Professor Theodor Meron, who pointed out already in 1996 that to be effective, protection of the environment must be continuous and ongoing, and not contingent upon whether there is a state of peace, international war, or civil war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stavros, for your very kind introduction. Thank you again for coming and listening today. Today I will talk a bit about our project, the Toxic Crimes Project, and I already said that. It's a project that is hosted at the University of Helsinki, Faculty of Law, at the Anti-Institute of International Law and Human Rights. So I'll just briefly go over the main idea and the purpose of the project. And then I'll delve a bit deeper in the part on the project where I'm working on, which is mainly environmental monitoring in the war in Ukraine. So briefly speaking, so we have at the moment we have 3 team members. As I said, it is an interdisciplinary project. So we have Stavros, who is an expert on environmental law and international law. Emma Hakala, who is working for the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, also alongside this project. She's an expert on environmental security and environmental policy. And then there's me as the PI, and I have a background in social sciences, sociology, anthropology, and currently in the field of sociology of law. So briefly speaking, our project has 3 main aims. So first and foremost, we look at how experts have advocated for a new international legal framework to protect the environment in armed conflict. So we look at how experts and lawyers have advocated or worked on the PARC principles, the new definition of ecocide, the ICRC guidelines, etc. Then we look at the politics around how these frameworks could be implemented. And third and lastly, we look at the practice and the obstacles of environmental monitoring during active wars. So Emma, for example, looked at the Balkans, and I'm working on Ukraine. And part of the project is based on qualitative work, so interviews with these experts and environmental safety experts who work in these conflicts. So I will present now a bit of the third part of the project, which is based on the different obstacles of collecting evidence on environmental harm in Ukraine. And throughout this presentation, throughout this whole event, we first moved from the historical, then the climate security, the legal. So now we'll delve a bit more into the sociological aspects of environmental protection. So if we think about collecting evidence on conflict pollution or environmental harm during conflict, it's been kind of widely established in the literature that establishing environmental and health impact of conflict has always been challenging due to various practical issues like ongoing violence, small sampling sizes, problems of access. Environmental experts cannot access sites where there has been conflict pollution, etc. Another more broad problem is that if we think about environmental damage during conflict, when we think about war, the first victims that come to mind are people that are maybe tortured or people that perish due to bombings, etc. So the impact of that violence is very immediate. Whereas if we think about environmental violence and the public health impact of environmental damage during war, it's much slower. So we can make a distinction between immediate impact and slow violence, in the sense that it may take very many years in order to finally see the results of environmental damage and the public health impact. People might develop diseases only after decades of time. So it's very difficult to establish when people got exposed to certain pollutants, etc. And some of these impacts are also rather invisible. Pollutants in the soil, they might not be immediately visible to people living in those areas. And often the impact of those pollutants or environmental harm is not shared equally. It's often vulnerable groups who are the main casualties of toxic disasters in general, not only in wars, also in peacetime. So when we think about evidence collection, there's often a distinction made between what we hear nowadays a lot is that about collection of environmental data during armed conflicts is that we have to bridge the evidence gaps, meaning that we have to collect enough evidence in order to establish that there has been environmental damage, which is in a way a very technological way of looking at it. Social scientists who have worked on the aftermath of toxic disasters in general, not only during war, have a more political interpretation of evidence collection, meaning that risk assessments are often prone to disputes, even when there's solid evidence that already exists. So, for example, sociologists of risk say that what a risk is usually depends on who has the authority to define it, and not only on the available data. And what counts as a toxic or toxic exposure often remains very disputed by states and corporations, even when it's very clear and we have the scientific evidence about the harmful properties of those toxins. And this is mainly based on social scientific research and people who have done ethnography after toxic pollution incidents. So I would like to discuss how this plays out during the war in Ukraine. And I will briefly make a distinction between the periods from 2014 and 2020 to 2022, and now February 2022 till today. So I'll start with the first periods. As already been mentioned, the armed conflict in Donbass happened in Europe's most significant man-made environmental burden, meaning that Donbass is a very polluted region to begin with. It has between 4,000 to 5,000 potentially hazardous industries, heavy industries, coal mines, chemical industries, etc. So this conflict happened in an area that was already at risk. It was already pre-existing pollution, legacy pollution. People living in the area who were working in mines, for example, already had to deal with work hazards. There were a lot of accidents inside mines, for example. There were domestic gaps in regulation, for example, with especially around storage of toxic waste that is coming from the mines. Some of the industrial facilities, are abandoned, which means that it's very difficult to establish who is the owner and who is in the end responsible for maintaining those abandoned facilities that are still environmental risks. Of course, now the environmental impacts of the war in Ukraine is everywhere in the news. But this has been a problem since 2014. Since 2014, there have been numerous, the OSCE has published comprehensive reports on environmental impact then, but also a lot of Ukrainian organizations have been actively monitoring the environmental impact of the armed conflict there in eastern Ukraine. And during the interviews that I've had with people who've worked in that period before 2022, they were often quite disappointed that there was not enough international attention to this issue. But back then they also already used open source data. This is a map. This is a screenshot of a open access mapping site, let's say it like that, which gave an image of the various incidents in East Ukraine, which is called the Donbass Environmental Information System back then. Most reports back then divided three different sorts of impact, broadly speaking. So direct shelling of industrial facilities, the disruption of those industrial work processes. So For example, the conflict then made it so that some facilities could not continue their production anymore, and which meant that some of the, for example, the mines, they were not pumped anymore. The water was not pumped from the mines anymore, which meant that water would flood to the surface. Mine water is very polluted, and that water could seep into the soil and the drinking water eventually. And then the general collapse of the environmental monitoring system that was already present in Ukraine. Back in the day, the OSCE wrote a very comprehensive report of the environmental damage back then. It was published in 2017. And they concluded, one of the conclusions they made, that a sustained assault back then on industrial facilities was back then largely absent, even though such instances did occur, of course. So when I interviewed environmental monitors or environmental safety experts working in that area, they were quite surprised by that conclusion, or at least some NGOs were. So this is a quote from one of the interviews, and I'll read it for you. When the OSCE did field research in 2017, one thing we found out was that the impact of hostilities on chemical pollution is actually quite low, apart from a few cases, and on average is basically zero. And then this interviewee starts to reflect on the various conflicts between monitors on how they made different assessments. Whereas some of the other NGOs were really crying out that now the area is badly polluted because of the combat. And it was not because of the combat, but one of the reasons is that Donbass was already polluted before. So these kind of things are just quite dangerous because they could disrupt the trust people have in environmental data and environmental monitoring. Of course, today the situation has completely changed. After February 2022, Russia has sustained and indiscriminate attacks on energy and water infrastructure, chemical plants, oil depots, and farmlands, etc. And I think it has become very clear also because there has been a lot of attention in the media on environmental impacts of the war, that we are now at a very critical junction in which there is at the moment a lot of data available on environmental impacts of the war, alongside an increased international awareness and the Ukrainian government's a willingness to collaborate on promoting or kind of highlighting environmental harm in this war. And I think this is due to, several processes are currently going on. There's been a lot of use of remote sensing, use of citizen science, especially by the Ukrainian ministries. So citizens who would report on environmental incidents. A willingness of the Ukrainian government to monitor the situation actively. But also nowadays the Ukrainian government is pushing through certain EU directives, especially on waste storage facilities and waste management, in the framework of its association agreement with the European Union. Ukrainian prosecutors have brought several cases on ecocides before domestic courts, and the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine is actively monitoring the environment and has reported damages in its Ecosakroza database that is publicly available online. And most of that data comes from reports from citizens. But also internationally, there have been a lot of NGOs, especially the Zoya Environment Network, who have immediately started to map out the various pollution incidents, damage to water and wastewater facilities, damage to gas distribution networks, etc. Across Ukraine. This is a map from March 2022, so very early on in the war. the open access mapping online website, the website that was first focused on Eastern Ukraine only. They expanded that to the whole of Ukraine. So this is an interactive map in which you can have an overview of all the various incidents. I think one of the main risks at the moment is that we could focus on Ukraine only, but there's an enormous risk that this war will have will cause transboundary pollution. Not only so the effects will not only be felt in Ukraine, but also across the Black Sea region. So in Belarus, Moldova, Russia, the Sea of Azov, and ultimately the Black Sea region. Partly this could be caused by leaks in industrial waste storage facilities, so-called tailing storage facilities that store the liquid waste of the mining process. If there are breaks in those dams, that it could spill the water into nearby water bodies, which could ultimately lead to transboundary pollution in the Black Sea region. This is a picture taken from a report from the Conflict and Environment Observatory and the Soy Environment Network. They published a series of reports that are very comprehensive on the impact of the war on various sections like the industry, the marine environment, nuclear, and the impact on the nuclear sector, and etc., and the water. So here, this is just to give you an image of like how remote sensing data is currently being used to map out various pollution incidents in the Bua estuary, which is near Mykolaiv. There have been several incidents along the estuary here. So you just see how satellite images are currently used to kind of highlight all the various incidents across a relatively small area. So here there's especially a risk of damage due to pollutants, including heavy metals and asbestos, for example. Besides remote sensing, there's also still among some environmental monitors the desire to beyond remote sensing, there would still be a need for on-the-ground sampling, which would be an enormous task if you especially look at the scale of the environmental damage currently going on in Ukraine. So this is one interviewee who previously said there's some stuff which you can pick up remotely, which is very hard for people to question. It's very difficult to question these pictures, but you don't necessarily have actual physical samples on the ground of, say, a pollutant. And I think, just to conclude, I think it's often tempting to look at various small incidents or some of the incidents that have happened now in Ukraine, but it's actually the whole scale of environmental harm and all the incidents together that that paint quite disturbing and depressing pictures of the environmental impact, which would probably last for decades and which would be very difficult to monitor. Thank you very much.